And we're live, I guess.
I still have off air on mine. There it is. Okay.
Excellent.
Yep.
So, I'm here on this splendid evening to speak to Jordan Owen, a writer, a musician, and also a YouTube creator, although the last one somewhat begrudgingly and chaotically in the last years. Um, about his album, The Aftermath.
Yes.
And first of all, Uh, the question I think is good and equally bad in that is it is completely general, but will give you enough room to express your thoughts.
Uh huh.
Anyway, let us go on. If I don't miss anything, actually, it is the fourth album that you share in its entirety with your audience. There have been Nightscapes,
Yes.
uh, a kind of ambient jazzy album.
Mm-hmm.
There have been there was Noise Work, a
Yep.
more noise industrial thing, and
Yep.
there was also somnambulism, kind of
Yeah. Yep.
more symphonic thing.
Correct.
But
Yeah.
it was
Those records. Those were all. Those were all instrumental works, and to the viewers, I'm sorry if I sound stopped up. It's because I am. But those were all instrumental works. This was kind of a foray into this was more of a foray into a sort of progressive rock, progressive metal vein, kind of vocal, vocal stylings, that sort of thing. It's basically a concept album that I was prompted to do to kind of work through some of my own. Some issues I was dealing with as far as kind of getting my life back together after a difficult period in my life. So it's a nakedly honest album. It's one of those things I wanted it to be almost painful in a way to hear the lyrics. I wanted it to be so as nakedly confessional as possible. And I'm working on another album now of vocal music or lyrical music, I should say. And I'm just trying to continue in that vein and make my solo albums as much of a personal journal, personal diary as possible.
well. I think you answered my question, which I wanted to ask, which is what differentiates this album from the rest
Mm-hmm.
that you've published, beyond, of course, the addition of the vocals.
Yeah.
Because it was quite apparent with all the build-up and the way you were speaking about it in public that you were treating it in a very special way, and you also wanted
Yeah.
it to be taken in a very special way.
Hmm. Well, it was not. It's one of those things that there's a tremendous transformative power, I think, to music and to the creation of music. That if you dig into difficult things in your life and you're able to come out bearing gold in terms of something, a new uh, work of art, then you can, that for me is what really kind of I guess seals the casket on that time in my life, because I now have something that I'm proud of that I can move forward with proactively. So that was really kind of the motive force behind the album, was just transmuting it into, taking a time in my life where I had no I had very little control over what was happening to me, that I was being antagonized by outside forces, uh, a time in my life when I had to kind of allow myself to hit rock bottom and reevaluate where I was and what I was doing, and take all of that and just recalibrate it as something that was musically rewarding. That is what really personally puts me back on track. It's kind of a ritual, if you will.
Well, both lyrically and musically, there are lots of different things to this album,
Yeah.
lots of different motifs, stories to be told
Hmm.
and find. One thing that I can start with, because it was kind of on my mind recently when I was
Sure.
thinking about this album, is really the deep uh, discussion of masculinity that you seem to have, and your personal, I guess we could say trauma with it, because as your reviewer, I remember you speaking about with your session with a therapist about it,
Mhm.
even
Yeah,
about how people who uh, basically got their way with violence and treated and objectified women, not in the SJW but real sense,
yeah,
were
yeah,
a particular trigger, if you will, of yours.
yeah,
And basically, you've kind of partially willingly run yourself into this swamp, and
yeah,
seems to be of people who thought exactly like that, and not only that, but they were really vocal and proud about that.
yeah,
And that seems to be a thing that you are venting on some of the tracks,
yeah.
and in a
Well,
very interesting way too. So I wanted you to.
sure, sure. Well, that getting into that, I was, there's so much backstory there to that. It's such a strange journey for me because growing up, at one point lived in a part of a very conservative, very conservative part of the American South, where women, on the whole, were not treated well, and it informed my early kind of worldview about a lot of things, and it actually pushed me in a very throughout my high school years, my college years, pushed me in a very I almost want to say anti-masculine sort of direction, because you kind of adopt that cynicism that masculinity could only, is somehow the whole thing about masculinity being a prison and all of that. And you kind of want to naturally adopt that. And all that really happens when you adopt that is you kind of remove, you kind of remove from yourself the possibility of self-actualization, because there is the one thing that I had to kind of come to realize over the years is that, as far as society is concerned, and this is not to say, I should emphasize, by the way, very clearly, that I'm not suggesting that women are just baby factories or something like that, but on a sociological level, if a woman wants to dedicate herself to having children and just birthing and raising children, society on the whole will go along with that. Society on the whole will not. The society on the whole has no biological default for men like that. You don't have a default. You have to go out and you have to do something, and you have to, make yourself worthy of passing on your genetic information. That's kind of a hard reality. And the thing is, when you recognize that hard reality, you can uh, have a couple of opinions, or there are a couple of different paths you can take. One is to go hard down the road of, you know, societal conformity, that if you buy into that extremely conservative traditionalist society, you will eventually attract a woman and be able to marry and be able to procreate and all of that. Another path is to kind of go your own way, not to use that term as a loaded term, but kind of go in your own path
Yeah.
and seek out, consciously work to seek out uh, partners whose values are a mirror of your own. And that's more difficult. That involves you working uh, on an individual level rather than involves you working on an individual level with everybody rather than just kind of ingratiating yourself to the tribe. And that's why, I mean, you hear so many in very conservative circles, like down in the South where I live, you hear so many people, well, we met at a church picnic. Well, of course you did, because the society was setting you up to pair bond that way. It's much more difficult, but I think more rewarding, to meet someone that you connect with on that individual level. There are other responses to it, though, and there are two kind of polarized versions of toxicity in this realization. And one toxic version is the resentful version. And that's the direction of like Elliot Rodger and Adam Lanza and that little puke, whatever his name was, Cho, something or other, the Virginia Tech shooter. The guys who they have this attitude of like they can't get laid, the incels, they can't get laid, so they're going to make the world pay, and they shoot up the school or something like that. That's a very toxic manifestation. And another toxic manifestation is to say, well, you're going to do the prototypical dude bro thing. That you're going that the whole world is divided into alphas and betas, and you're going to knock everybody down and shake your dick in their face and fuck you if you have a problem with it. And the problem is we live in a society now where people who want to go that uber traditional route are either ignored or antagonized or mocked, I should say. And people that want to go that uber individualistic route are kind of they're kind of ignored. I don't want to say ignored, but they're kind of written off and dismissed. It's like you're on your own. You don't, and understandably so. You're going against the grain of what society wants. So it comes down to the dialogue has been about masculinity, has been and masculine drive has been, and I bring it up in terms of masculine drive because that's kind of the essence of masculinity that we're talking about, is that you have to go out and make a case for yourself. And so
Just
it's
to
come
quickly
down
jump in, to make it clear to everyone,
yeah.
that I'm sure that by the hyper individualistic way, you don't mean the Elliot Rodger path that you've mentioned.
You don't mean what?
The Elliot Rodger path that you've mentioned.
No.
It could be. I just,
no, Elliot Rodger was not the shooter guys. The incels, they're not individualists at all. They're conformists that don't like that they don't know how to conform. That's all they are. They long for nothing more than conforming to the world, and they can't. That's the difference. The individualist doesn't have any use for the machinations of the herd. This thing over here doesn't have any use for that at all. That's the that's more the Ayn Rand, John Galt, Howard Rourke type of a character that I'm referring to there. The Elliot Rodger types. The problem is that what I was saying is the problem is the discussion around masculinity has gone into this very narrow focus of you can be an incel, mass murdering spree killer, or you can be this horrible, disgusting dude bro, pickup artist, misogynistic piece of trash. You can fall into this very narrow frame, and things that are more mutually beneficial to yourself and the world at large are kind of ignored in this discussion, and they're ignored for a lot of reasons. They're ignored because on the one side you've got the pickup artist masculinity coach types that are trying to make money off of this thing that's like if this vision of masculinity that's like if Ernest Hemingway was metrosexual, that kind of thing. And then the mainstream media and all of that wants to talk about incels and that sort of thing, because the only dialogue that we have about heterosexual masculine men now is about how everything in the world is their fault and we have to blame the entire world, blame the failings of the entire world on them. So in the album, some of the themes talking about masculinity in the album was just, I had allowed myself, not willingly, and I was never actually a part of this, but in terms of public perception, I was perceived as being part of this kind of group that was sort of a masculinity cult. And looking, these people who were trying to, who thought that Fight Club was a projection of how things ought to actually be. And, within that, kind of looking at that from the inside out and confronting the hysteria of it and the madness of it and everything. Those themes are on full display in the album, and it's one of those things of like, it's one of those questions of like, accepting, not only accepting that you failed, but accepting that on some level you failed as a man, is a and that's something that's kind of laughed at and ridiculed in a lot of circles nowadays. But again, if we want to have any kind of healthy dialogue uh, about men, we have to talk about a healthy actualization of masculinity, which is all but ignored in the modern society. So yeah, those themes are on full display in the album.
And it's actually the healthy realization of masculinity that concludes one of the tracks with you saying that you are the alpha and the omega. And
Yeah, well, that was the
really
thing was,
what is your
yeah,
vision of the overcoming?
I'm sorry, say again?
What is your vision of the overcoming, to lend the Nietzschean term?
Well, the thing with at the end point of the album, the album follows a very precise narrative arc, and of course, those who know me and know me personally, and what I went through during this period will know kind of exactly what I'm alluding to in a lot of these songs. But one of the arcs at the very end, what you're referring to towards the end of the album, there's a realization that where it says, "I am the Alpha and the Omega," and this is because at the beginning of the album there was a track called "The Alpha," or towards the beginning of the album there's a track called "The Alpha," which was kind of uh, just this brutal, sadistic, savage portrayal of what's being referred to in these kind of masculinity cults. And the line, you know, the lines in the song, rape what you love, I am the alpha, drown in my seed, I am the alpha, laugh as you die, I am the alpha. It's just that vision of that sadistic, towering, tyrannical vision of masculinity, and
Glorianism.
realizing that the that the people who are built, who are the practitioners of that vision of reality, are just uh, they are no different from the incels and the Elliot Rodger types in terms of their worldview. It's just that it's just a version of that. It's just the person that you become if you're that kind of person and you start getting laid. And so it's this thing of like, you know, not just to creating a hierarchy, which is a natural result of any free society. Not just creating a hierarchy, but creating a world where it's you on top of the mountain and everyone else bowing at your feet. And that very sadistic vision of masculinity, of godlike glorification for its own sake, was what was kind of expressed in the song "The Alpha." And then towards the end of the album, I had a song called "The Omega," and that's the Omega. If you look at the so-called, if you want to call it, manosphere terminology or pickup artist terminology, or however these things are used, they use the Greek alphabet in kind of an extreme way, where we all know what an alpha male is and a beta male is in general parlance, but they expanded out that there's epsilon males and sigma and everything else. There's just they have a letter for all the different Greek alphabet characters, and finally getting down to the omega, and the omega being the man that the men at the absolute bottom of the totem pole, and the men that absolutely nobody would ever have any desire for, the ones that that not only cannot get laid, but have no right to get laid, have no right to have contact with the females, and they're the worthless, completely dismissible also rans of society, and also that and all of that. And when I split away from this kind of split away from any association with this kind of masculinity cult, the inevitable charge arose that I was an omega male, that I was, completely worthless and without any kind of hierarchical position and all of that. And kind of those ideas floating around in my mind, I thought about in the Bible, in the Christian Bible, Jesus Christ refers to himself as the Alpha and the Omega, meaning, he was there when he was God there when the world was created, the Alpha, and he will be, he'll be there at the final, or he'll be the final entity that exists when creation collapses in on itself or is raptured away or whatever. So the first and the last, the Alpha and the Omega, which is where that line comes from. But thinking about that, what I was thinking about was kind of this dualist, kind of transcending the dualism, if you will. That when you meditate, you become the in Buddhism, achieving the Buddhist tattva, the level of the Buddhist tattva, the supreme enlightened being, means transcending the dualism. And so for me, combining those two lines meant sort of realizing that realizing that there's an element of myself that finds, accepting and coming to terms with the fact that there is an element of myself, just like there's an element in all of us, that finds that brutal, hardline, sadistic masculinity, superiority masculinity thing appealing. But also coming to terms with the fact that there's an equally valid part of me that rejects it completely and is completely disgusted by it and feels compassion and sympathy for others and wants to live go down a path of love and empathy and compassion, and realizing that I don't have to choose between these two extremes. Rather, I just have to balance these two extremes. And that was that realization. And that's why in the record, when that line is said, immediately everything stops and you hear the sound of a baby crying. In psychotherapy, a baby crying means that, or in psychotherapy, crying means that you've had a breakthrough. If the therapist is able to get you to cry, then whatever you cry about is your kind of breakthrough moment, and that's what was holding you back and everything. And so that realization, coming to that point, bam, you get the crying baby, because we've achieved equilibrium, we've started over, we're reborn now. So that's what was being said there. And on that note, I need to go grab a Kleenex because I'm all stopped up. I'll be right back. Anyway, sorry about that. So
No
anyway,
problem.
that's kind of where all of that was at.
Actually, psychotherapy was exactly where I wanted to go, because another association arose in my head with something that you actually also mentioned in one of your past videos, being dialectical behavior therapy
Yes.
by Marshall Linehan, and it's
Yep.
also a concept present there heavily.
Yeah.
The tearing down of dualism by the way of dialectically combining the
Yep.
contradictory elements.
Absolutely.
In terms like acceptance and change. And
Yeah.
there's actually a fascinating story behind that, being simply that both people who were treated to accept themselves, I think challenged with borderline disorder,
Yes.
personality disorder, both people whose therapy was focused on acceptance, and ones whose therapy was focused on change,
Yeah.
actually ended up with very bad results, often killing themselves, as it is very common with people afflicted with that disorder.
Well, the
And,
thing with I'm sorry.
and
Go ahead.
yeah, like
Well, yeah, you're right. I talked about dialectic behavior therapy before. It was something that I read up on extensively and read. I have the book that's considered kind of the cornerstone or capstone text on the subject. And dialectic behavior therapy actually is it's a very interesting practice. It delineates from cognitive behavior therapy in that cognitive behavior therapy says that whenever you're confronted with something that is a source of distress for you, I don't like to say triggered because that word is so overused, but when you feel distressed by something, what you do is you have kind of a thought process that you immediately go into to kind of cycle that out of your awareness. Because what happens is you're gripped by a feeling like something is happening. You're afraid that this event is going to recur, so you immediately start telling yourself, this event is not occurring. I am here in this room, in this environment. This event has not occurred. I am going to focus on this, what's going on around me. And you alter your cognition so that fear is no longer has anything to attach to. And the idea with dialectic behavior therapy was, well, we're actually going to turn that on its head, and we're going to focus in on the physical symptoms that you're feeling. So if you're feeling fear, and maybe your manifestation of fear is chest pain, or it's intestinal cramping, or it's shortness of breath, or there are all these manifestations. What it says is we're going to actually focus on nothing but that feeling. We're going to ignore the world around us. We're going to go completely into that feeling and zero in on it. And we're going to try to hold on to that feeling. And paradoxically, what happens is as you try to hold on to that feeling, it starts becoming harder and harder to hold on to it because the feeling's not real. It's not actually based on anything. If you're actually in distress, if you're actually dealing with an actual problem that's causing you fear and distress, you can't focus on how you're feeling because you're focused on the actual problem. But if you're having panic and anxiety and you're purely focused on those feelings, what starts to happen is you start to look around the world for triggers or explanations for what it is, and you start to think, oh, well, I was eating at this restaurant, or I was watching this movie, or something like that, and something about that triggered me. It's like, no, that's not what happened. You're drawing an association that wasn't actually there. So you focus in on the feeling and try to hold on to it. And my version of that with the feeling is to think about it and say, okay, come on, you little bastard. Let's see what else you got. What else can you do? Come on, more. I want more. Give me more. Give me more of this. And I start fighting, challenging that part of myself to start giving me something greater than what I'm already experiencing. And it can't do it. It always immediately backs down. And Peter Gabriel has that great line: "The monster, when I simply allow it to be, it has no hold over me. The monster I was so afraid of lies curled up on the floor, just like a baby boy." And that's exactly what it is. That was the benefit of dialectic behavior therapy for me. The practice began as a treatment for women with borderline personality disorder, and I say it began as a treatment for women with borderline personality disorder because obviously while men can have that as well, it was first diagnosed and first treated in women. And so it started out as a treatment for that, and it's very much about that, not trying to choose between extremes, because people with borderline personality disorder are people who go from one extreme to the other. And it's rather than trying to choose between extremes, it's about balancing extremes, and that who you should be is a balance point between these two extremes. And so, yeah, that's also, I know, having kind of studied the lyrics of the album, that's another theme that comes up throughout.
Well, it's actually something that really nicely describes all of the contents, but also relating to the music, which is very much into melting different extremes.
Yeah.
There are the soft parts, there are the heavy parts, and actually, that was something I really wanted to ask you about, because
Sure.
About the pure compositional aspect of it.
Yeah.
Over how much of a long period did the tracks arrive in the state that they did? And what was the writing process, purely musically? Or maybe it was somewhat intertwined with the lyrics writing?
Well, it's interesting. What happens is you start to develop over time. It's kind of like when you're a musician, especially a musician in the modern age. I don't know if classical composers necessarily did things like this. I know I know people like the musical composers like Andrew Lloyd Webber will, they'll write a good melody and think, oh, that's really good. I'm going to hold on to that and see if I have a use for it down the line. And for me, the I will sit in my studio for hours and hours on end pursuing little ideas. And the thing is, I love, there are bands and artists who have what they do in the bag. They know exactly what they want to do every time, and they produce very similar sounding albums, good albums, but always along. Hang on. So sorry. Always along a very similar conceptual continuity. So, AC/DC is a great example of that. Like, they're going to do Australian redneck blues rock with heavy distortion and every time. And, it's like somebody said about, somebody said that AC/DC has put out 10 albums that all sound exactly the same. And Angus Young said, oh, he's a bloody liar. We've put out 11 albums that all sound exactly the same. And that's good. For some people, that's good. I have always identified with people like Frank Zappa, with people like The Residents, with people like Psy, and Mirai Kawashima from Psy is one of my great influences. The band OOIOO, things like that, where there's a certain innate amount of experimentation going on. And what people don't know about music, experimental music, is that the experimenting is going on constantly behind the scenes. So I will sit in my studio and come up with some idea, and it might sound like it could sound like a combination of things. Like, I'll be thinking, well, what would Aphex Twin sound like if they collaborated with Megadeth, and just wanting to put that into the brain splicer and come up with something on the computer and see what happens. What would happen if what would happen if you took the chord changes to Giant Steps and put them on put them on this weird ambient synthesizer, and then added blast beats behind it. As weird as these things sound, these experiments keep happening, and as you do it, you start to find all of these just beautiful kind of vignettes, sonic vignettes that you want to explore and evolve upon. And that, I like to, it's not a very good metaphor now, because he now has a recording career, a music career as well. But I try to be like the David Lynch of music production, where we're going to, we're not pandering to a particular style. Rather, we're taking the styles and using flashes of them to create something that internally makes sense in and of itself. It's like a dream. A dream you hear, or when you're in a dream, the dream always makes total sense when you're in the dream world. When you're dreaming, it makes sense. When you wake up, it makes no sense whatsoever. You try to explain it, and we're like, what was this, that, and the other? But inside the dream, it makes total sense. And so with the cross genre kind of thing, it's not like, it's not like we're trying to just say, oh, well, let's showcase a rock band playing klezmer music or something unorthodox like that. It's more like, well, let's try to get a whiff of the essence of each of these things as an ingredient for a larger, newer whole. And the bands that can do that, Psy, that I mentioned, one album that I'm always referring to as Imaginary Sonicscape by Psy, is just an unbelievable realization of this. And of what I'm talking about. The Residents do it extremely well. OOIOO does it very well, and some other groups like that. And trying to kind of create those unusual vignettes. And what happens is, over time, you'll have a repository of them. You have a collection of them on the hard drive. And so then when it comes time to create a cohesive album, to create a cohesive whole, you start to look back and think, I've got all of these vignettes and all of these kind of dreamlike experiments that I've tried over the years. What of these can I pluck out and evolve and that kind of thing? A great example of that would be if you look at the track Obsidian on the Aftermath album. That opening riff that I had, the that bit on the 7-string, I had come up with that riff ages ago, along with that overlay of the hyperactive staccato keyboards that are going that I had that from like something I had come up with years ago. And so I'm thinking as I'm writing this, I'm like, okay, I need something to like, I need to create this feeling where we come on just charging with this feeling, and then we stop. Then we stop and we break into this very this very chill kind of, uncomfortable sort of groove. Like we know it's going to break out again, it's going to explode again at any second. And so I go back to that riff and I'm like, okay, well, there's something we can work with here. And that's part of the compositional process. Now, other parts of the album were written entirely for the album. So, a lot of this was built around the lyrics. It started out as a libretto, as a series of lyrics, and started building things around it. The song Eisenbach, which was kind of a mission statement for the overall album, and it's the not that anybody really does singles anymore, but it's kind of the lead single off the album. It's the first track. That song was written to capture, a very specific, capture the essence of a very specific set of lyrics, and everything in that song was pretty much written for that song. I didn't bring any outside pieces into it. So one of the things I do try, one of the big influences in that song, though, I can tell you, is the way Porcupine Tree and also Opeth, who are big collaborators with Steve Wilson from Porcupine Tree, the way they'll use these almost like sitar-like guitar lines, these kind of create this kind of raga effect, and that happens you hear that in the opening riff where there's this minor second, this flat 9 that's happening in the riff, and it's droning over this open E, that kind of thing. Things like that, that's a very conscious influence right there. And then lyrically, some of the stuff went back, like I know you had expressed to me an appreciation for the song Thorns. Thorns was actually, not the instrumentation, but the lyrics and chords and vocal melody was a song I wrote back in high school. And I brought that back in its entirety and put it in the album because I was like, this captures, there's so much that this song captures the essence of this transitional point between these two other tracks. It comes in between the song The Alpha and the song Crawl Away, Crash Landing, or Crash Landing, Crawl Away. And because of that, it was just this perfect little transitional moment right there. So there's a wide array of things that happened that brought this album together, and it's so funny because the album I'm working on, I'm doing another album now that deals more with relationships and interpersonal relationships and that kind of thing. And I, in that one, I'm doing, most of it is being written organically. There's not a lot of referencing back to earlier ideas, but that sense of experimentation is still there. So.
Well, that is very exciting in the way because it seems that you have blended nicely consideration for the lyrical aspect and the musical level of it, and the narration made you, and the emotions made you think of particular musical choices. So that is a very interesting aspect of it for me.
Thank you.
So coming into it, you weren't thinking about making per se progressive metal album, for example, or did you have any preliminary points or
Well,
boxes?
it's one of those things. I can uh, I can sympathize. Everyone knows my favorite author is Harlan Ellison, and something he struggled with was people would always refer to him as science fiction writer Harlan Ellison, and his thing was like, no, I'm just a writer. I write, and he would tell you, he's written nonfiction and essays and book, movie, and television criticism and all of these things that are not science fiction. His range goes way beyond that. He's just known as a science fiction writer, or he's known for his science fiction, but he's more of a writer than just that. And what I run into is, I am known as a metal guitarist, as a progressive metal guitarist, and it's one of those things where it's like, I can, if I put out a jazz recording, someone will review it and say, heavy metal guitarist Jordan Owen abandons his metal roots for jazz and all that. And what they actually don't know is my jazz roots predate my metal roots. But the thing is, being that's there's always a certain sense of comfort in that in that style of writing and a certain natural fluidity. The new album that I'm working on actually doesn't have any. It's got strong progressive rock elements of like Yes and Genesis and Marillion and Pink Floyd and that kind of thing. But it's not a progressive metal album. It's very much a different sort of record for me. And so in this one, I wanted to go in a way that was, with the Aftermath, a way that was as comfortable as possible, in the sense that it would be a style where I could just I wasn't testing any waters. I could just very comfortably and very easily go into this style and say everything I needed to say, and so progressive metal is the undercurrent of the album, and and for that reason, it was very much a realization of, and of wanting to make that kind of album, if that makes sense, of wanting to make, needing to express myself through loud, distorted guitars and a good amount of screaming and that kind of thing for certain elements. It needed to be said that way, and that's why there are some strong industrial elements on it, some very Nine Inch Nails, Skinny Puppy, KMFDM type moments, because you have to have that maniacal, sadistic, screaming aspect as well. And so, it was literally just birthed out of what do I need to get to say what I'm trying to say. And it's not an album, as much as I love smooth jazz and would like to do a smooth jazz album. It's not an album it's not points I could make with a smooth jazz style. It's got to be made at the top of your lungs. So
that I understand, and you have said a couple interesting things about the lyrical stuff, because you said that all the lyrics, not all the lyrics predated all of the music, but at least the lyrics predated the album.
Yeah,
music.
Absolutely.
And what was the? Oh, so if you already want to answer, then I won't hold you back.
I'm sorry. Say again.
If you want to answer, I won't hold you back.
Oh, what you?
I won't hold you back if you already want to answer about that.
No. Finish your question. That's fine. Finish your question.
No, I just wanted to ask you about how this came about, because I know also about. You said a very inspiring quote. A very inspiring quote from Harlan Ellison about how writing is easy, and just you. Open your veins and bleed into the typewriter.
Right. The famous quote from. He said that writing is easy. You just open a vein and bleed into the typewriter, and that's what it was. Writing the lyrics on this, it's funny. I actually, the time period in which the lyrics were written, there always in my stuff be certain literary references and that sort of thing, and things like there's a song, for example, on the album called "Swallow the Tears of Sin," and that was such a powerful statement to me, because that's exactly you know, that was exactly what it was, how I felt. That statement, you know, and what that song is about redemption, and it's this kind of, you know, gospel tinged, almost, you know, I don't want to say Christian themed, but kind of come to Jesus, sort of fall on my knees and accept redemption kind of moment, or accept salvation kind of moment in terms of turning my life around. And so swallow the tears of sin, that expression comes from a book called Roadside Picnic, which Stefan Di Iorio and I do a podcast called Book Talk. Stefan and I did, at the time that that was being written, we did Roadside Picnic as an episode of Book Talk. And Roadside Picnic is a very interesting story because it's about a future, near future world where aliens have visited Earth. And we don't know exactly what happened, but we know that they were here very briefly. And the sites where they landed, the landing sites are strewn, which are, you know, hundreds of miles by hundreds of miles wide. These kind of wastelands where the aliens landed are strewn with artifacts and, you know, weird, like, empty battery casings and everything for their transports and all of that. And in the book, in Roadside Picnic, it's about a guy who's a stalker, and a stalker is somebody who his job is to sneak into these wasteland, these, you know, bordered off wasteland areas illegally and steal these artifacts to then sell on the black market. And so that was, it was such a powerful thing for me, powerful metaphor for where I was in my own life. And so there's another line, like in the lyrics to Eisenbach, there's a line, wandering the wreckage like a stalker in the zone. I still hear your poison words, although I walk alone. And that was, you know, that was very much a reference to Roadside Picnic, because it felt like that. It felt like, you know, I felt I identified with this person whose life had been reduced to, you know, basically sneaking into what's a glorified garbage dump, and, you know, sneaking back out with worthless remains to sell on the black market and everything. I felt like that kind of person, like I'd gotten down to that point. So that was, you know, that was one influence on the lyrics, was the literary references, and there are other literary references throughout the record, but trying to on every song, trying to come to, like, I knew there were going to be these, and there's 12 tracks on the record, which is kind of, I didn't intend it this way, but it's almost like a 12-step program in that way, like that there's this 12-step progression towards kind of getting back to the right place. And so each one of those tracks has or each one of those songs, the lyrics have a very specific and very prominent symbol that they're built around, some kind of symbolic concept that they're built around. And so the lyrics were really born out of just going through my own personal process and finding a symbol that identified each one of these steps. And from there, kind of expounding on what this symbol meant. And that became the lyrics for each song. So, you know, some of them are very obvious, like the alpha was meditating on the concept of the alpha male and what it was doing to my, you know, what being surrounded by that kind of psychopathic interpretation of masculinity was doing to me. You know, some songs are more some songs are more direct than others, like that. You know, the song "Blind in a Deaf World," that title came out of this feeling like I was in a world where, you know, I could not comprehend or interpret what was going on around me, and at the same time, no one else could interpret what was going on with me in such a way that they could help me, or give me the help that I needed. It was this kind of, yeah, it was this weird thing. It was a combination of you know, public crucifixion and misinformation and that sort of thing, and you know, people, close family and friends, not not understanding what was going on or what I was going through. So it's this weird thing where it's like you're blind and you're saying, help, I can't see, and I'm calling out for help into the world, and the world doesn't pick up on what's going on, and then the people that do take your hand and start leading you in a very destructive and disturbing path, because they're trying to take advantage of you. So it's things like that. It's like taking that symbol, that idea, and expounding on it. And that, there's a song on there called Fetal Position, which was that was an extremely literal song, because it was written at a point where I was, literally just laying in bed like this, like just not wanting to acknowledge the whole outside world or anything, whatever. And the only thing I could make myself do at that point was get a notepad and paper and start writing out lyrics. And so, Fetal Position is just a very profound, precise symbol of what was happening. So that was the process for each of those songs. Thorns, I mentioned, predated the writing. One idea that predated the writing, but not the lyrics, was the title "Dancer in the Dawn." That idea, that title, predated the writing of the lyrics for the album, but the lyrics themselves, the substance of it, was very much where I was in that moment.
All the lyrics are, on the one hand, as you say, very rife with metaphors, with literary uh, allusions. But on
Mhm.
the other hand, there is a lot of very blunt references to events from your life that
Yeah,
anyone who has followed, even somewhat loosely, your YouTube career
yeah,
is sure to pick up. And I
yeah.
wonder about. I guess it was a form of coming with you to terms that your privacy is raped, as Lane
Mhm.
Staley has once sung.
Yeah.
And
Well, yeah.
plus, you have not had no anxiety about exposing yourself this very brazenly courageous way.
Well, the thing is, part of it was, part of what happened was, no one tells you this. If you become, but everyone who's pursuing any type of career that involves any level of notoriety needs to know this, even if your goal is not something as shallow as just to become famous. If you achieve any amount of fame, if you become a public figure at all, you anything that goes wrong in your life goes wrong in front of everybody. And that's the thing. Uh, it's one of those things where, like, even if you keep it to yourself, if you try to keep part of the story to yourself and don't say anything, then what the world at large will do is just make up whatever rumor best fits that part of the timeline and keep going. So you have to decide. It's like, do I want to expose if I'm going to be exposed and embarrassed for my shortfalls, better they be what's honestly going on rather than whatever is made up by some jackass to fill the void. And so that was something that was very much tackled in the lyrics, with lines like, "My failures fill the newsstands while he slithers away," that kind of thing. As far as yes, there are very blunt references to things that I went through, and it's because it's one of those things. It's an almost punk rock kind of thing of, like, there's a time for metaphor and analogy and philosophy and that sort of thing, and then there's times when you just want to put two fingers in the air and be screaming with a clothespin through your nose and do the punk rock thing. And so there are certain very bold, very frank statements that needed to be made in reference to that. And that's that they come out. It's one of those things where it's the album is it's an angry conversation with myself. And what happens in an angry conversation? There are peaks and valleys, and you have You have valleys where you're talking quietly and reassuring each other, and then there are peaks where you're screaming and yelling. And so those moments needed to happen, and it was, and it's one, and again, it comes back to that thing of like, uh, if I have to go through this in public, then I'm going to go through it in the most honest way possible.
Was this pain rewarding to you? I mean, it had to be, but is it more a belief that it will be rewarding in the long run, or do you already somehow see the harvest of this?
Well, the reward for me is being able to, as I mentioned before, being able to kind of get this, get something out of this that is purely positive and purely productive, and get this piece of art created. If a piece of art, something that I deeply value and something that means a lot to me, can come out of this, then then all of the things that took me to that point are no longer have that influence and that sway and that hold over me, because they're no longer they're no longer steps towards a negative end result. They're steps towards a positive result. So it becomes all worth it in the end. So to that extent, I would say it's already, it's already feeling good. It's already helping, and that's tremendously important. Am I totally out of the place I was in 3 years ago? No. Will I ever totally be out of it? I don't know. I doubt it. But I'm enough out of it that I can go to work every day with my head held up high, and interact with people in my life who genuinely matter to me and are genuinely important to me, and feel good about it. Not feel like a feint, not feel like a fake, just, feel like a real, uh, decent human being. And that's the essence of any kind of therapy. It's like, we're never going to, you can't click undo on what happened. But at the same time, uh, you have to ask yourself that question. Do you really want to click undo on what happened? Because uh, once you do that, you go back to being the person who got into that situation in the first place. And that's the difference. So, that's the difference. That's the thing, is it's like, as I look at who I was when I got into the situation I got into, I was far more shallow and superficial than I am now. I was far more desperate than I am now. I was far more impulsive, and and my values were all over the place and absolutely in the wrong places. And that's part of why my real friendships and my real connections suffered as a result of all that. Um, I was not a person. I was not the person that I am now after having gone through all that and being forced to confront all of that. So again, it's that kind of thing of like reframing everything, reframing it as a journey towards a more positive result. That we had to go down into the dark, into the depths, into the underworld, to come back up with what Joseph Campbell would call, the boon of the hero's journey, that kind of thing. That's how it has to be reframed, and that's what the album does for me.
Another great theme that runs through the great theme of the album is toxic relationships.
Yeah.
And I wonder, actually, because obviously it is somehow universal, because it deals with defamation, it deals with artistry.
Yeah.
Isn't there also a romantic element to it? Perhaps.
In my lyrical themes.
Yes. To what
Uh
extent is it universal, do you think?
oh, okay. Oh, you mean just the universal, the idea, what you're saying, like the lyrics about toxic relationships apply universally to all toxic
Well,
relationships.
I could have it both ways, both
Yeah.
that and factually.
Yeah. I mean, in that sense, yes. What I'm talking about toxic relationships applies all across the board. But I was, the lyrics are never devoid of a specific reference point, and to a specific toxic relationship that I was in, which in my case was not a romantic relationship, but um, there are certainly people who, by way of seeking romantic relationships, find themselves in similar positions. So no, for me, it refers to a very specific time in my life and a very specific set of events. But I think, it's something that anybody dealing with any kind of toxic relationship, any kind of narcissistic codependency, is going to be able to relate to in the extreme.
Well, really something that made me uh, enjoy this album was
Thank you.
the solo guitar solo aspect of it
Hmm.
all. Because usually I'm not too much of a shred enthusiast. I find it usually to be just technical wanking.
Hmm.
But here it somehow fitted the overall context
Yeah.
and often merged very nicely.
Mhm.
Somehow served also as a contrast to more melodic parts.
Mhm.
The contrast thing being very
Yeah.
common with this album. Melodic parts being intertwined with more dissonant ones,
Yeah.
and so on. What
Well,
about,
yeah. Go
yeah,
ahead.
yeah,
Well,
I just wanted to ask you about,
the guitar work on the album uh, came from, I don't mean to sound pretentious when I say this, but it was a long, long time before I started to be satisfied with my own guitar solos, and I say that because other people aren't looking for the same things that I'm looking for. They're looking to hear maybe a good guitar solo, some good shredding, some good you know melodic stuff, that kind of thing. And I, like all guitarists, every guitarist thinks he's the most underrated guitarist that's ever lived and everything. And I'm trying to find like new depth and a new depth in what I'm doing. And it's kind of like, to draw a metaphor, it's almost, if you think about rapping, if you think about rap lyrics, like there are guys like Tech Nine and Twista and all that who have this like just motor mouth, uber fast delivery. Like they just blast out lyrics as fast as they can blast out lyrics as fast as they possibly can, and uh, and that's great. That works that if that delivery is in accordance with what the song is trying to say. If it's furthering the goal of the aims of the music, then it works. But then you have someone like Notorious B.I.G., who's one of the most legendary rappers of all time, and you listen to an album like Life After Death, which is a masterpiece, and he does not do a lot of technical rapping. It's almost like spoken word poetry, and it's that same kind of thing because it's what the music calls for. And so my constant thing with my guitar solos is listening to the music in question and amplifying, using the shredding and the technique and all of the shredding and sweeping and tapping and all of the wild techniques and the Steve Vai stuff. I'm sorry, I'm so sinus pressure. Anyway, this, all of those amazing Steve Vai, John Petrucci, Jason Becker techniques and all of that, using all of that to elucidate the music. And that's, I think, why, if I can pat myself on the shoulder, I think that's why the guitar playing on the Aftermath works, is because there's not one, I can safely say there is not one solo in there that is, there's not one solo in there that happens just because it's time for a solo, just because I want to show everyone what a great guitarist I am and all of that. Uh, I'll give you an example of like that self-editing was on the song Obsidian. The guitar solo happens. There's this very melodic, kind of, I guess, almost like Steve Vai for Love of God type moment in Obsidian for the guitar solo, and then it picks up and starts going fast again after this haunting break moment right there. I did the guitar solo and then I actually I edited out half the guitar solo because that solo originally continued over the fast part and just starts, flying and everything. And I took that part out because I realized it was just so unnecessary. It didn't add anything because we were returning to a riff we'd already heard. We're going back to a passage in the song we've already heard, and this uber fast solo didn't really add anything. It didn't really help. But then you go look at there's an extended shredding solo on the song Crash Landing. And on Crash Landing, there's this long extended shred guitar solo, and it's because it's meant to imply a kind of temper tantrum, a kind of just blowing up of just this point where we're beyond words and we're just thrashing around and thrashing literally thrashing around and having this kind of anger and this unleashing this raw animal anger and fury and all of that. And so that solo comes in right at that point where it's like, and it communicates that. It's like we're beyond the point of words. This is a pure emotional moment. It's an expression of emotion above and beyond words, and that's the magic of music anyway. Is that it conveys conveys emotions beyond words, and so that's the thing with the guitar solos on that is just always finding, never settling for a filler guitar solo or a background thing. It's always just finding what's going to land perfectly, what's going to hit. There was another moment where, like on the song Fetal Position, I decided to put in this kind of spoken word monologue segment in place of one of the guitar solos, because I just thought, well, the way this song works, it's such an aimless ambient kind of song anyway, and I've already done a little bit of guitar soloing on it. So if I do this long extended solo, it's just going to kind of drift. It's not going to grab you the way it should. So I just took that out altogether and said we're going to do this spoken word thing. And I think it was that willingness to kind of self-edit that made the guitar parts work, and made I think of my background going in, a lot of my background going into music and performance and everything began with my interest in musical theater. And you would if you listen to Cats or you listen to West Side Story or something like that, the instrumental breaks. During the instrumental breaks, it's not like the actors just stop and stand still on stage. No, they're dancing and their sets are changing and they're dancing and things are happening to advance the story, and that conveys in all of the instrumental breaks on those on the studio recordings for those classic Broadway shows. In that same vein, I wanted to accomplish, I try to accomplish the same thing in that there should never just be instrumental for the sake of instrumental. It should be capturing something in your mind. I remember one of my teachers in college said that he listened to Rush's 2112, and whenever he got to the guitar solo, he imagined that was where the priests in the Temple of Syrinx were chasing the guy through the halls to get the guitar away from him, and it should always imply and inspire something like that.
Do you plan, on a somewhat another note, to go live with the material and with your solo career, or is it going to be a purely studio-based project?
Right now, it's studio-based for one specific reason, which is that I have this is not something I've been terribly vocal about yet, because I want to get everything, everything has to be in place for everything for what's about to happen. More will be said as becomes relevant, but I'm working with a new band now that it's the momentum and the potential behind this band is greater than anything I've been in before, and so all of my attention live wise right now has been focused on that. We've been, putting together our lineup of live performers and getting this ready and everything, and so everything associated with live performance is geared towards that right now. And I would love to do a live version of the Aftermath and of all my solo stuff at some point. It's certainly very desirable. But as far as like right now, I'm calling up the best people in my mental Rolodex to come be a part of this project that I'm working on, and everything live is geared towards that. And when that album comes out, we're working on an album right now with that band, and when that album comes out, people will be able to see very clearly why I was like, this is where all of that energy is going. So I would love to do some live stuff with the solo projects, and I think it could translate very well to a live setting. It's just finding players who can play this kind of music and are willing to do it for little or no bread, because it's we're obviously at the bottom tier of the independent artists and everything. Finding those players is very, very difficult, and finding the time for it is very, very difficult. So right now it's just a studio thing.
I was wondering if you are willing to expand, maybe not to air any dirty laundry, but let us start from, is there any chance for the Live in Babylon LP that was in the works to ever see the light of day?
So Leaving Babylon had one album, and and I either wrote or co-wrote all of the material on it. I quit Leaving Babylon in towards the end of 2017. I quit, and another member of the group quit as well. I don't want to air too much dirty laundry, but it had just become very clear to me that group had done all it was going to do, at least all it was going to do with me, and that I just was ready to move on. And it was not in a, people always cite creative differences. Actually, creative differences were not the issue. It was a very good creative environment. There's no doubt about that. But there were differences in business decisions and business decisions, what we wanted the group's next step to be, and then what our long-term goals were, and that kind of thing. The group that I put together, having left Leaving Babylon, I put together to take advantage of certain career opportunities that would have gone to Leaving Babylon, and so this was the direction I wanted to go, and I was like, I'm sorry if we're not seeing things eye to eye. So as far as there being as far as the second Babylon album seeing the light of day, I haven't really been in touch with those guys since I quit. But the one song I took with me I took one song from the writing sessions that I wrote the entirety of it. I took the entirety of it except for a couple of parts that I rewrote and moved on with, but I wrote all the lyrics, vocal melody, that kind of thing, and the guitar parts and all of that. So I took that with me to the new band. But that beyond that, I've not really been in touch with those guys, and I don't know what they're doing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, I think it is a nice time to wrap it up, given that I am completely mortified and was throughout all of the interview, as was, I think, pretty clear. Since I am
mortified?
Yeah, somewhat. I mean, I'm your great fan for many years, and it was a pretty much stressful situation for me. I hope it didn't seem that it wasn't that visible.
Well, I hope I wasn't too. I hope hope it wasn't too disturbing of an interview for you. No.
No, it was great. It was
Okay.
great.
Good. Good.
I really hope that everyone who will listen to it will also appreciate it, as I think our discussion was really, uh, really good. And I don't know. Do you want? Is there anything that linger in your head during the time that you thought about this album that you wanted to add?
Well, there will always be a lot that lingers about in my mind about this album, and uh, you know, it's it's just at the end of the day, it's just a testament to the fact that wherever you are in life, the journey has to be the destination, and you will if you are ambitious and career oriented like I am, then you have to make the journey the destination, because otherwise you are setting yourself up for a lot of frustration and aggravation and desperation and that kind of thing. And if there's a moral to the story, it's that taking actions born out of a sense of desperation is seldom ever a good idea.
And on this excellent note, we finish this interview. Thank you very much, Jordan, for this conversation.
Yep, my pleasure.